closing up is Zach, Wong, and Jingyi Pan. Zach's preferred pronoun is he, him. Jingyi preferred pronoun she, her.
Perfect. With that, we're going to the end of introductions. Congratulations on making it to quarterfinals. We'd like the Prime Minister to start the debate. Before that, remember, before you guys start speaking, ensure that you guys are audible. In terms of timekeeping, I'm unsure if we have anyone to screen share. Do we have anyone to screen share within?
No, we don't. If you want, you could do that.
No, so I'm basically taking notes on my laptop, so I won't be able to.
Right.
So we probably don't have anyone to screen share. So yeah, maybe just if the OC or anyone can just put out timers like markers on the chat on 1, 6, and 7, that would be helpful to the speakers. So if that's all sorted out, we'd like the Prime Minister to start the speech.
I just like to ask how clear I am because it will affect how fast I speak.
You're clear. You're clear.
Thank you so much. Inasmuch as Asia's diversity is astounding, the struggles that exist within this diversity is astounding as well. Because of the way that society has formed and because of our colonial pasts, a lot of Asia's struggle are divided within different tribes, within different ethnic groups that are yet to meet and are very difficult to unite politically. But at the end of the day, they share the common struggle of similar things like cultural appropriation or even the extent of pride. And I think that we deserve a unifying banner at which strategies are already clearly defined that already has the political momentum that is necessary for us to create change. So the first thing that I want to note in a bit of framing is that we understand that there are different struggles, and we understand that though we are adopting these strategies, that there can be little variations or different fights in totality in terms of how these strategies are adapted in terms of specific nations. So just because we say the word pride doesn't mean that we also don't have other strategies within our own language or that are more central or fight for different needs that are more specific to us. The main thing that we are forced to defend in today's debate is merely supporting adapting similar strategies, but not 100% the same strategy. I think it is unreasonable for us to assume that we fight only for Western things. I think that we can adapt the same things. So what this means is that we understand that individuals have different struggles insofar as they have different backgrounds. But I also think that at the very base level, they all want similar things. Freedom from discrimination, things like civil rights. So even if we have different nuanced struggles, the very same basic struggles will exist across the board, and this ought to be something that we push for together. Sure, Oo.
Yeah, can you just give an example of a strategy that is like Western? Besides just terminology, I mean like a strategy.
Okay, so I think that the prominent strategy in the West right now is fighting for a lot of their battles within courts. And I think that we're more than willing to adapt that within our side as well. If it comes to strategies that comes from narratives, I think things like Me Too are something that we're perfectly able to adapt in the East as well. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how does this policy get broad support for the movement, which eventually resorts into tangible change? I'm going to argue this on two levels, in terms of the local support that we get, and the third level in terms of the international support. So the first is in terms of general awareness. The first thing that you have to realize is that even in Asia, the West dominates media and social media. This is because the algorithms that exist in dominant media platforms are more often than not based off of the algorithms that exist in that same social media platform in the West. So when it comes to bumping up specific posts, you are likely to bump up posts with similar banner statements as what is trending within the West. The same is true for traditional media platforms. Insofar as a majority of the East is far less developed from the colonial West, a lot of the media platforms are merely sub-branches of Western media platforms that chose to create other branches within the East. What that means is that a lot of their stories are shared, and a lot of the same principles of these media platforms are likely to exist and to manifest in the type of stories that they share. So what does this mean? It means to say that in terms of us getting general awareness and people understanding the plights of our cause, not only is there a media awareness that already exists because this is trending in the West, but it also allows us to ride on that trend, on that political trend. So what this means is that people's interests are already generally piqued because they already have existing sympathies for the stories that they've heard about in the West, and they'd like to see how this adapts within their own country. But number two, it rides the political momentum of these statements and these stories being bumped up. But secondly, in terms of local support, I think that the framework on how to move forward can exist in terms of similar strategies that are similarly applicable. Insofar as many Eastern countries are colonial powers within the East, a lot of their constitutions and political mechanisms are based off of the political mechanisms that were existed in the West. Insofar as Japan or even the Philippines constitutions were heavily adapted from their Western counterparts, what that means is that a lot of the civil rights fight strategies applies when we're working towards government frameworks. That means the extent of the battles that we fight within courts, the extent of what we can pressure politicians to do, and what the Supreme Court ought to do in terms of a specific strategy of the Supreme Court. But I also think that these frameworks allow us to learn from the mistakes of our Western counterparts, that we ought not celebrate things like gay removal as from the list of mental illness when we understand that the majority of our society or a majority of the LGBT community is still within that list. So not only are these strategies similarly applicable, but also a lot of these mistakes that these movements in the past have made are things that we can avoid when we choose to adapt similar strategies. But the third level in terms of local support is in terms of the people's perceived strength of the movement. Social movements in Asia are quite small. This is either because a lot of the conservative values still reign supreme, but number two, a lot of the struggles are divided between the different ethnic groups that make up Asia's diversity. So the first level in terms of local support is I think that they're going to be unable to get any sort of change if they stay within their small groups, and all of these different groups are competing for the very same attention, which leads towards the very same changes. So a unifying banner in the East not only unifies the different countries in terms of what exactly it is they are fighting for, but it is also the fact that local movements themselves can work together for the same things. I think that what this does is it makes it a bigger threat towards politicians on the two levels. No, thank you. The first is that in terms of the political voter base within their local countries, they feel as though it is much larger. But number two, I think it is a bigger threat to politicians when they understand that this movement exists cross-globally and they aren't the only country dealing with this problem. But number two, I think that when you make the movement much larger and when you make it seem like it is gaining traction through unifying the East and also capitalizing on the traction already in the West, people feel as though there is a chance to create change. So in terms of civil movements in the East, wherein they feel like they could be ostracized from their communities from speaking out against conservative values, the way that you get people to speak out is to make sure that they feel as though there is a large base that is willing to support them despite their views. But secondly, I think that a lot of individuals already have existing sympathies for the West. Insofar as the West has been successful in gaining sympathies in terms of sharing stories or using strategies like Me Too, the fact that this media has reached far into the East also means that existing sympathies in individuals who can access Western media, or more often than not, the political and economic elites, are individuals who already have existing sympathies for similar movements. If we capitalize on that existing sympathies and we make these struggles seem extremely similar to those, I think that we are likely to gain their support. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that speech. We'd like to call upon the first speaker from side opening up.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible, yeah.
Okay. Before I start my speech, just a real quick disclaimer. I don't know if my partner and I are the only white people in this debate, but we are two white Americans. So I just wanted to say this is not something I would ever take a stance on in real life. I wouldn't want to. Oh, okay, we're not. Okay. This is not something I would ever take a stance on in real life. I would never claim to be an authority on this outside of debate. I think it's really important that I not present myself as a real life authority. I'm just, doing this for the activity. So with that out of the way, I will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we think that there are two purposes of social movements. I think first, social movements provide catharsis for marginalized groups by making them feel heard. Simply being in a community of people dedicated to making the world better for people who look like you and simply feeling heard is extremely emotionally powerful and fulfilling when that is the only place when you can feel like that and the rest of society rejects you. Second, social movements need to change minds. You can't get change by simply forcing people to go along with you. You need people on side to vote with you, to respect you, to not attack you, to not, if your families, to not reject you, etc. We think that Western terminology is actively harmful to both of those goals. And those two purposes are going to make up the content of our two arguments. Firstly, why Western terminology denies people of their identities that are emotionally important to them. And secondly, why it actively makes conservatives more hostile to social movements. But firstly, what is our stance? And this is where most of my rebuttal to opening government is going to be. So we are fine with movements by different ethnicities or even in different countries within Asia standing in active solidarity with each other. We are fine saying that this is something that they ought to emphasize with the same fiat power that opening government uses to say that they'll use Western terminology. And we think that like terminology should come from local languages, for example, using Hijra in India to describe what we in the West might describe as transgender people. But for the sake of solidarity, we're totally fine with inventing new words and concepts if necessary. And like, and here's the thing, I do actually think that this would be necessary because Western terminology is just bad for the job of different ethnicities standing in solidarity with each other in most cases. Like, what Western term would even allow you to do that? Like, you know, people of color, it doesn't, that term doesn't really make sense in most of Asia because everyone in, or, you know, almost everyone in Asia is what a Westerner would consider a person of color. So we're fine with, for example, a new local concept to describe the various ethnic minorities of a given country. We don't see why that has to be a Western term for it to be unifying. And then in terms of strategies, I just think that like there are just not that many political strategies that are meaningfully Western. I think that, so for example, like a lot of the political strategies used by the civil rights movement that are core to Western political activism were pioneered by Gandhi in India. And I really don't think like fighting through the courts counts as a Western strategy. Like, okay, I'm fine with standing behind on our side of the house. Social movements maybe study the West a little bit less, but since they don't have literally the same governments, I really don't think fighting in a Filipino or an Indonesian court is meaningfully the same strategy as fighting in an American or a British court. I think that we are fine defending like these movements, fighting through the courts. I think that's a bit of a ridiculous burden to put on us. Okay, all other rebuttal will be integrated. First, how does this deny people's identities? And I think there are two general ways that this does this. Firstly, just on a very trivial level, this terminology just often doesn't fit with how people see themselves. And to use an example here, I think that like, I think a good example is the Hijra people in India who are what we might in the West call transgender, but it's not really the same concept because in, the term Hijra has a very specific cultural meaning within India. It refers and like, you know, with and has a specific cultural place within Hinduism. It refers to people who are mythologized to have magic powers, something that a lot of living people today still believe in. It's not really the same thing, and the word transgender doesn't really capture how these people identify. Why is this such a bad thing? I think firstly, I think social movements often have a huge amount of power over how ordinary everyday people are seen and thought about. We think that social movements are often trying to bring these people and their struggles and stories into the forefront. I think therefore they have a responsibility to represent these people accurately, to show these people how they would want to be seen. And a lot of these people just don't want to be known under Western terms because that's not how they identify, and the terms don't actually capture the full range of their feelings. Social movements ought to make them feel heard and ought to give them catharsis by allowing themselves to be heard, and we don't think Western terminology is good at doing that. And the second reason, and so what they could maybe say in response to that is, oh, we're fine with using local terms sometimes and Western terms other times. So here's why Western terminology is often actively a bad thing. We think that part of why colonization was bad is colonization of the mind. That is to say, Westerners violently forcing Asian people to see themselves and their culture the same way that Westerners do. That means that throughout Asia and throughout anti-colonial movements within Asia, there is an emotional power in actively rejecting Western worldviews. It is a reclamation of something that was stolen from people, the right to see themselves as beautiful and important and powerful. And we think that this is a right that people should have. We think that like these people often actively reject Western labels as a mode of political activism, and to tell Hydra people that they should call themselves the Western term transgender is an affront to that to the power of these anti-colonial movements, something that is incredibly emotionally important to these people. It amounts to objectification for the social movement that claims to represent these people to instead tell them how to identify and to misrepresent them for their own aims. We find that unacceptable from opening opposition. Does closing have a POI? Okay, I'll take opening.
Look, it's unreasonable to assume that we're going to use Western terms to talk about our colonial struggles. We're talking about struggles that are definitely similar towards towards the struggles within the West. So why isn't it bad that we use the term pride, which is broad anyway?
Okay, but that misses the point. Like, you know, a struggle for attention and visibility for Hydra people isn't an anti-colonial struggle, but you probably do have to defend using terms like pride and transgender for those people. I think that that's bad for all the reasons I said. It doesn't have to be an actively anti-colonial cause for there to still be power in not using Western terms and rejecting Western worldviews. That's still powerful. Second point, why is this bad at appealing to conservatives? Fairly simple, right? Conservatives are often very traditional and religious, and we think that movements like feminism and movements for LGBT rights are often tarred and smeared with the inaccurate accusation that they are Western impositions. I cannot think of a better way to play into that and a better way to give conservatives an automatic reason to reject these movements than to use Western terms. We think that this is actively setting yourself up for failure when that's all you're giving yourself to work with. We think that it is far more effective to highlight the place that these people have within your own culture, to highlight the ways that there are already terminologies within things like Hinduism for powerful women and for transgender people. We think that therefore, we think that maybe this doesn't convince every single traditionalist. Obviously, neither side can do that overnight, but we do think that they become significantly less hostile at the point at which they can't just lazily claim, oh, this is a Western imposition, and actually have to deal with and consider these ideas. We think that this at very least avoids the worst backlash and is more effective at changing people's minds. That means less hate crimes. That means more people voting for you, like with you. That means more people turning out to your protests. We're very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for that speech. We'd like to call upon the second speaker from side government.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible, yeah.
All right, I'll just drink water. All right, so for POIs, you guys can just type it in chat. I'll be reading anyways, and I'll be timing myself. Movements do not get their strength from how important the value that they are fighting for, rather through the amount of critical mass that they can galvanize using the strategies which they use. We think it is abhorrent for opening opposition to try to squirrel their way out of this debate. We think the strategy that they're planning to use is problematic in two ways. The first is they never characterize or mechanize how their strategy will look like under their side of the house. So DLO has to clarify that, or maybe closing opposition can try to. The second thing you would say is that we think it makes the groups much more splintered under their side of the house. I'm going to answer two main questions in my speech. A, where do we get social change for these movements, which is a goal that opening opposition conceded to as well? But second, is it principally justified for the movement to adapt this kind of strategy? Now let's do some extraneous rebuttals to opening opposition before I get to my case. The first thing that they talked about was Western terminologies don't always apply, so we can't apply it in this Asian context. We agree. No term in any place of the world can completely represent all groups of people that it tries to represent. But rather, it is a banner statement by which people can unite under because it is easier to gather more critical mass and easier to get more backing. In fact, we say like pride groups in the West, for example, don't necessarily represent all sects of transgender or gay individuals, but they still unify under it and still go under it because they know it's easier and much stronger to present a unified front than a divided front. And this is the kind of strategy that we're trying to prove to you coming from opening government, unresponded to by opening opposition. But second thing we say is that this unified front helps bridge the gap between the common goal of baseline, because it helps them get to the common goal of baseline respect, which is necessary before you can get to more diversified goals. So we do agree that different sects of transgender groups or different sects of gay groups, for example, have different goals, but we say the baseline goal of, let's say, anti-discrimination, for example, is more important because that is the leverage and that's the groundwork by which you are able to get more goals in the future. No response from opening opposition. The second thing which they said is that colonialism will come back. Note their argumentation, because if it is true that colonialism will come back and colonial roots will be implemented again in these like past colonies, that means that all the individuals there on the ground right now in these Asian countries would reject all forms of Western culture, media, and lifestyles. But the fact is they aren't. So opening opposition's argument is a response against all forms of Western dominance or Western imposition in terms of media, culture, like Facebook or Google, for example. So if they want to run that kind of argumentation, they have to defend why all forms of like products by the West, for example, are bad. We think that argument is unnuanced in and of itself. I'm going to respond to the conservative argument about how we change policies in my speech, and it's going to be integrated. Now, number one, why is the alternative in opposition much far worse? Given that this debate is out where we get policy change, it's very hard for opposition to get that kind of policy change, given three structural reasons. The first is because they have ununified statements. The reason why the movements in the West work is because you had mass media galvanizing crowds with similar statements that resonate with them. These resonating structures make it much easier for politicians to look at these movements and be threatened by them because they are a unified front, rather than just looking at them as a gay movement, or rather than just looking at them as a trans movement, for instance. This is because you get more critical mass on average, which is important for getting policy change. Because note that politicians aren't threatened by how much moral weight your value has that you're trying to fight for, but how much votes you can take out of them in the next elections, for example, or how much votes that you can pressure on them, for instance. And that is the true critical mass and true change that we're planning that we can get under opening government. The second thing we would say is that there's less sympathy on opening opposition side for different Asian members. Because note that you have different goals for LGBTQ members in Cambodia, Philippines, or Thailand, for example, but they're all generally fighting for the same kind of baseline respect of anti-discrimination. We get this because at least when we get the entry-level policy change, what we're doing is we allow for further diversified goals in the future, which makes it much more easier because now we already have the baseline respect and people understand what kind of context we are going through. You don't get that same kind of respect under opening opposition because people believe that you already have two varying kinds of respect, and it's very hard for politicians to try to weigh which one is more important than the other. In fact, we would say it's worse under opening opposition because given you have different groups fighting for different kinds of respect, then the best case scenario is that you would pick one group over the other group, and thus this one group becomes, the only one with respect, and you leave out other sects of the LGBT community, for example, or other sects of the civil rights movement, for example. So only one group will rise within that power structure under opposition's best case scenario. We think that's faulty because then they leave out the rest of the movement, their principles side of the house. But the last thing we would say is that intersectionality can still exist under our side of the house, because even if you look at Western groups like Black Lives Matter, for example, they have different groups for poor Black minorities or rich Black minorities, right? Or trans people have a different goal than gay individuals, for example. The reason why they're under one banner is because they have a similar angle and similar intersectionality point by which they are fighting for, and that is important because given that similar intersectionality point, it makes it much stronger for them to fight under a unified front rather than what opposition might give to you. On opposition side, you splinter the group by focusing and saying that one group's need is over the other, and it's much harder for politicians to then weigh which is more important to fight for. That is why we think that the kind of conservatives that you want to change under their side is much harder, or at the best case, you only help one group rise over the other and not necessarily the other group. But lastly, we would say that the last thing they're imparting describing to the rest of society by doing that kind of change on government side is you're giving less catharsis, and this is how we respond to the goal of opposition. You give less catharsis to the movement in general, because then you say one subculture of that movement is much more important than the other. We think this is problematic for 3 reasons. It makes the fight harder given there's less critical mass, divides the front, and you don't get structural change. Before I move on, opening up.
We were very specific in our stance that we are fine with actively emphasizing solidarity within these movements and inventing new terms in the local language to do so if necessary. You had to explain, and never did, why Western terms are necessary in order to have a unifying term for everyone instead of local.
All right. That's where I get to our worst case scenario. Because given that Western terms are important, it is because Western terms are able to link the information gap between Asian groups and Western groups to be able to help them unite under a similar front. So yes, maybe they have different on the ground experiences, but the shared experience of anti-discrimination, for example, is something that they all want to galvanize for. And the other thing that you would say is, given that all Asian groups are uniting together, or like different LGBT communities, let's say, for example, from Singapore, from the Philippines, from Thailand, for example, are all uniting under one banner, it makes it easier to pressure politicians, because now the pressure is not just on one domestic country, or it's not just a domestic affair anymore. It's an international battle, because you have multiple Asian countries that uniting against their politicians. That gives a much larger pressure and much larger incentive for politicians to act. So we say on the ground level, at least we make it so that we make the fight not a domestic fight alone, but an international fight, meaning we have more pressure all in all. Very proud to advance.
Thank you so much for that speech. We'd like to call upon the last speaker from opening half. Here.
Am I clearly audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Two things in the speech. First, what is best for accurately representing people's identities and what people want and gaining catharsis. And second, what is the most effective strategy of persuasion and actually pushing social justice into the minds of conservatives, the people you need to change the minds of. So first, what do they tell you? Or what do we tell you? We tell you that social justice movements have a responsibility to accurately represent the people that they're advocating for. When they do not do this, they're marginalizing and disenfranchising the very people they're supposed to represent. When you have terminology that comes from the West that only applies to in the West and is completely different than in Asian countries, it doesn't mean anything, and it misrepresents people's individual view of themselves. Like the example that Gwen told you, what might be considered transgender in the West, there's a different word for it in Asia. And the same applies for many other different types of people and different types of groups. This is very important because it means that as so far as they're unable to use the accurate language that represents the people that they're advocating for, they're unable to accurately push this change, because how these movements speak and the language they use determines how people in society view these groups themselves. It determines how society names these groups. So when you use this Western inaccurate terminology, you're inherently harming the image and ability for these groups to self-identify and represent themselves and gain the cathartic benefits of having your identity recognized in the public space. So insofar as this is not the case, they can never gain track, or the benefits they claim can never mean much, because the people that they represent are always going to feel bad and misrepresented, and so their benefits are only like optical, but don't actually apply to the minds of the people that you're supposed to represent. They say that in response to this, that one subculture is more important than others in our world. That's not true. Like, we can have terms that represent different subcultures. There's no hierarchy that we're imposing. We can have LGBTQ equivalent stuff in Asia. It doesn't mean that we have to go for like hyper specific terms for each different type of group. So that doesn't make any sense. And further, and so insofar as that is the case, and then they say that these, although there's different identities, they have the same goals. But that ignores the point that we're making is that the identity is what matters, and people need to be accurately represented. Even if they have the same goals, we can have terms that represent different groups with the same goals, but the identity themselves have to be accurately represented, or else the people will never be able to fully realize themselves within these societies, and societies will never be able to accurately accept these groups for who they are and name them how they want to be named. That's really important, and it means that the benefits, like at the very end of the line, never really play out. But finally, second, what's best for policy change or persuading people? We tell you a few things. We tell you that in order to get conservatives on board, who you have to get, because if the governments weren't appealing to conservatives, then there wouldn't be the need for these social justice activism in the first place. Then you're unable to actually advance any social change. Why is that bad? That's bad. That's bad because you have to. Why don't they get that? Because when you use Western terminology, you're inherently using phrasing that that represents like colonialism. It represents like foreign Western impositions, things that people who are traditional, who are very cultural, don't necessarily like to like have that imposed on them. So when you do that, you have an extensive backlash where people say that they don't want to change because it's inherently Western, when otherwise local terminology could have had the same exact effect and persuaded them in more productive ways. We say that rich politicians are also like this. They have to appeal to conservative voters, and insofar as you're never going to be able to access the minds of these voters, then you're never going to be able to change how the government works or how society operates. In response to this, they just say, oh, we have more unified stance. But that doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. Well, two things. First, the whole idea that we can't have unity on our side is ridiculous. We don't have to advocate for a world where there's no unifying terminology. As Gwen told you, we can have these terms. Like we can make terms that represent like regionally, like different Asian countries, different groups within neighboring countries, different struggles that represent things in Asian countries. We don't have to defend hyper-specific terminology that applies to these different groups in specific countries. Like open government has to defend, and didn't really defend, why Western terminology specifically is what they have to stand behind. The one thing they do say is that it links Western and Asian groups, but this doesn't make any sense. Like we don't need to link these groups for anything to happen. Like Western activists are never the people that change the minds of conservatives within Asian countries. And then they say united under one banner, but we tell you we can have these unifying terms on our side. This is highly uncomparative. But furthermore, yeah, and that takes out a lot of what they're trying to say in their case about the whole unity point. But furthermore, they tell you that, oh, you need like local and international support, but we can have this when we have terminology that represents like the entire regions, different countries. We can have popular phrases that go up. The one argument they make that's specific, and the only argument they make that's specific to Western terminology, is about social media and how posts are bumped up. But this is not the case. In countries with different languages, like they have different ecosystems for what is trending and what is popular. What's trending in China is not what's trending in the US. What's trending in Japan is not what's going to be trending in a different country. Like what's trending is based on like where you are, and companies divide this stuff. So there's no actual unique benefit to using Western terms. And so this doesn't make much sense either. Why is this? Okay. And then they say that the strategies are largely applicable, but like, we don't understand what's uniquely Western strategy. We would say that they ask, what is our strategy? And we would say that we can have these terms, all the like terms that unify people, terms that mean a lot of things, terms that are accepted by millions or different countries. But we also have like protests. We also have like activism, like this, like the things that normally represent like how social justice movements operate, to put public pressure on governments and to actively like change the perception of how societies view different groups. Like we can have these very visual things and like the usual protest mechanisms that social activist groups have. Most of the social activist strategies in the West were just co-opted by other countries. Like it's not that they give one example that's kind of unique of like Me Too, but that can be employed in our point is that you can still have like a varied amount of strategies that are effective with terminology that is just as effective. And so on the point about local support, they say that more about unifying stuff and unable to change in small groups. But as we told you, we can unify with unifying terminology that's specific to Asia, and it doesn't mean much when you just use a Western phrase that no one can associate with and no one really understands. Like they say that there's existing sympathy, but as we told you, it's seen as like inherently Western, inherently foreign. So people are not really able to associate it on a local level or appeal to them on a personal level. And for these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for that speech. We'd like to call upon the member to start the case for the closing half of the debate.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible, Jaymal.
Great. Just give me 10 seconds. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, opening half never resolves the clash for you on why is it that these Asian movements are actually struggling and unable to get traction. We recognize that OG fails to deal with O's comparative of using local language and terms. We'll prove to you through our extension why that vocabulary and those methods fail to work in status quo in Asian countries. But before that, one explicit point of rebuttal to O. The first thing they say is that, conservatives will now run smear movements. They will go and face backlash and are literally going to be seen as an imposition of Western ideas. The problem with this argument is they anyways consider ideas like the LGBTQ plus movement or feminism as Western in nature, right? They anyways treat ideas like women wearing clothes and working on their own as a result of Western influence. This means that on their side of the house as well, conservatives can never actually be sort of converted into people who start suddenly becoming liberal, right? They're likely to give you backlash anyways in existing methods like protests or pride marches anyways, which means at best, the backlash which you get from conservatives is marginal. The difference, however, is on government is that the ability to actually go and rally the minorities and the victims themselves and the empowerment they feel is huge compared to side opposition. And that's what we'll prove in our side of the house. But let's deal with this entire idea of why local language cannot work. The first problem panel in current movements within the Asian countries is that the frame of the movement is decided by the oppressor. Things like civil rights, trans rights are not things which even exist in the Asian culture, right? Things like cultural appropriation is not something you and I care about in India. We're okay with Western people coming and taking statues of like Ganesha back home. We're okay with them coming and like acting like they're Hindus here and like wearing those sort of saffron clothes and like chanting Hare Ram, right? We're okay with these kind of things because we literally don't consider these to be problems within our Indian culture. The problem is when you actually go and engage with these people or your oppressors with the same language and the same movements which they themselves have dictated, the ability of them to actually understand with your movement and empathize with that is non-existent. Why is it so problematic, right? Notice currently, right? Notice opening opposition's alternative of using words like the hijra to like describe the LGBT, the trans community. The problem is these words now have a negative connotation to them, right? The word hijra is never used as a sort of word full of respect for the community, right? It's used as a demeaning word to actually take away sort of rights which they have, right? It's literally used to mock people on a daily basis. The problem is currently in India, words which they are trying to use to actually describe the movements have lost power, and the power of those words is in the hands of the oppressor to actually go and call you things to demean you on a daily basis, right? We think this means that you cannot use the vocabulary which already exists because it's simply beyond your power, right? But second, right, notice the problem currently. The movements in Asia don't have the ability to accurately describe what they're actually going through, right? Notice it is something which even O shows in their ignorance by saying that, everyone's a person of color in Asia. They don't need such words. That's absolutely ridiculous, right? You have people like the Siddhis in India who are from African descent, right? Who suffer structural discrimination because they look African in nature. We think these kind of people and the intersectional minorities do exist even in countries like India. At the point at which you go and assume that there are no people of color within these within these countries in Asia, is when you literally go and buy into the existing narrative that literally these words are not part of our culture, right? We think things like racism currently do not even exist as a sort of awareness point within these countries. It's only when you go and show reference points to the West, when you go and point to things like the BLM to show why these things actually matter and how they affect individuals, is when you are actually able to get some actual change and these movements get some meaning in status quo. But even let's look beyond that, right? Why is a reference point so important? OG never tells you what the impact of these local languages has on the minorities themselves or on people who protest, right? Notice how minorities are so disenfranchised from the government, right? They're completely disenfranchised from the movements because literally whenever they go out on the road to protest, people mock them. They face microaggression when people throw slurs and negative connotations at them, right? Like things like they'll make jokes on like the dark skin, etc., right? The difference now is at the point at which you have a reference point to a hugely successful movement like the Black Lives Matter movement or like the Me Too movement, etc. You know where to where a movement can actually lead to, right? You're able to reference to that movement, learn from those strategies, and implement them within your own movement. But even beyond that, right, within the existing ideas within the cultural modes of the country, mean you can never engage with them on the same sort of language which the opening opposition wants, right? When they tell you that, oh, you can just say that Hijra existed in Hinduism, so it's the normal thing. The problem is at the point at which you go and associate things like culture and Hinduism and religion within these conversations, you literally get these religious leaders coming and hijacking your conversations, right? They make the movement about something which it never really was about. But even secondly, right, things like LGBTQ plus was never even an idea within India, right? Within these developing countries in Asia. Which means they need some reference point to believe that the movement can be successful, right? In status quo, the governments and the people on ground literally don't even empathize with you, right? They don't even relate to the very ideas which you call your own identity. Why do we think people will now actually engage with you much better on our side? 3 reasons. First, we think individuals in status quo have an inherent bias towards these words and towards these sort of methods of protest, right? Which means things like Bharat Bandhs or things like just taking to the streets and having peaceful marches are tried and tested methods which have never really worked, right? We think now you need to have things like going and blocking the streets like Shaheen Bagh, things like going and destroying statues like the BLM movement is doing, right? We think we need those sort of methodologies to create the shock value and to change the language which we deal with our oppressors with. But secondly, right, we think to accurately describe the lived experiences which people go through, you need words like POCs to actually understand that people like Siddhis do exist within India, right? People do face racism in India, and things like cultural appropriation are not cool, right? When tribes literally get taken away, that the culture literally gets appropriated to the level where no one even recognizes them beyond no one even recognizes them or appreciates or credits them for the culture. We think that's extremely problematic, and we need individuals with the vocabulary to be able to define that. We need them to have a method to be able to actually go and cause some change, not be hijacked by the movements by conservatives like they want us to believe. But let's look at the last claim which opposition bench might make, right? They say we're fine with the other Asian movements empathizing with each other and we can still get international support. The problem is most movements in Asia suffer from the same problems, right? Things like civil rights are not even an idea within Asia, which means for these individuals to ever even get their own minorities within their own groups to come and support them, they just see this movement as futile, right? And we'll never actually get change because people will just mock us. It is only when you're able to reference to a movement within the West, you're able to show that these are ideas which exist in other parts of the world and have led to tangible change for women and LGBTQI members within those countries, where you actually get minorities coming and being associated with your movement, right? You actually get the change which opening government talks about. This give you the mechanism, but never why it actually happens, right? But the last thing is this, right? International support can never exist when individuals in the West don't even identify with your movement, right? When they think your movement is radically different from theirs, when they can't gauge your local terms, right? It's only when you're able to establish a common platform that you're able to leverage the capital of the West and the leverage the capital of these movements. We think we need to take away the power of these words from our oppressors. We need to use established words to define our unique struggles and our unique culture. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that speech. We'd like to call upon the first speaker from side closing up.
I forgot my timer. I apologize. Okay, if everybody's ready, I'll be starting in sorry. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. If OG would like to yield the 1.5 billion person population of China currently to us simply on their media point, we will gladly take this. Why? It seems odd to me that they would suggest that using traditional Western media techniques of social media and hashtags would work in the largest country in the world of 20% of the world's population, when literally their entire social media experience has been defined by the Great Firewall and how traditional Western ideals and approaches do not work. I will mention this more later, but this is an incredibly false premise. Second of all, we don't think that CG coming up here and saying, oh, civil rights is a Western thing, and therefore you need to have the idea of civil rights, and that's like adopting a Western strategy. That's not really the point of the motion. The point of the motion is like the specific markers that characterized Western movements to gain civil rights. Civil rights in and of itself is not like a purely Western thing. And for us to say, yeah, we want civil rights in Asia as well, is not us saying we're using Western terminology or strategy. The rest of my rebuttal will be interwoven. Okay, first of all, what is CO specifically going to bring to you today that has been largely left out of the debate, right? I want to illustrate first you who these people in social movements are and what their main objective is, right? People in social movements are marginalized either numerically, economically, or powerfully, right? They need the acceptance of a larger society, specifically those with power or rights or equalities that these groups lack. Note that existence sympathies across the world are less impactful at the local level, as outlined by the motion. Again, we would rather have people in my own home country support me than people in France or the UK or the United States. Now, where does this take my points? The first point, that extension I'm going to bring to you, is that the different underlying social fabrics in both the West and the East affect the efficacy of various strategies when it comes to social movements. Specifically, the West highlights ethnic identity and cause political or social instability as an effective tool for cause that is accepted and even praised because individualist culture put the needs and the rights of the individual above any base social paradigm, or more specifically, stability that is typically enjoyed within the country. For example, the United States was largely okay with Black Lives Matter protesting, even in COVID times, because the need of the individual groups to be heard and to speak their mind and to bring to light their historical inequity is much more important despite the larger social paradigm of the COVID lockdown. Note, this would not work in Asia because the larger collective culture inherently pushes back on the instability, right? Any groups that are cause of serious instability or are taking away from more of a collectivist nature will be condemned and not listened to. Already, marginalized groups lack power within the society. If they attack a collectivist paradigm and specifically using Western ideals to directly attack this, they will socially be rejected. A warrant for this, or an example of this, is the feminist movement in China, right? Instability in Chinese cities in the form of protests on the streets caused the larger Chinese populace to label these groups as troublemakers, right? And then when the resulting government crackdown occurred, as it always will or is often will happen, the larger populace was fine with this. Contrast this with 2 years later, where the feminist movement largely stopped protesting and tried to use traditional media tools like state-run media to build it relatively slowly and gain consent of the larger, more conservative culture to get on board. At that point, then they could ask for more and more extreme things. But if you immediately go to the Western idea of social instability as a tool for breaking down the traditional hierarchies and gaining rights, you lose this idea of a more conservative, stable, and collectivist culture, right? Now, that's my first point, and I'll take from OG.
Look, Asia isn't China. You can't deny that through the process of colonization and globalization, Western media has influenced and penetrated the East. That's why Me Too even found its way to success within China, because despite different social media platforms, there's still Western corporations that have influential power.
Okay, so the Chinese government banned the Me Too hashtag in China. Yes, we understand that the Asia isn't China, but we also understand that China's 1.5 billion people. And if you want to confine your movement to everybody but that 1.5 billion people in China, that's fine. Panel, please take note of that. I will answer everything else in this following point. Now, social movement is less effective. This is my second point here. Social movements are less effective using the same terminology across varied groups. This lessens the overall impact, especially when in conjunction with the same terminology and hashtags and movements being used in the West, right? OG thinks that critical mass, and this was followed through by CG a bit, should be accrued across the world. And backing, and this is the most important thing. This is wrong. Backing matters much more in your own country. The comparative here is if you alienate the people next door, but you get the West, you still fail in providing the protections and rights that are ultimately necessary for these underlying social movements. This entire point will clash with the CG's idea of a reference point and a rallying point for these groups as the linchpin for how these groups will build, right? Let me link this out for you specifically, because this is going to be a complex point. So what is the first kind of minor thing that happens? Well, A, you're going to be drowned out. Literally every other country that uses this hashtag or movement tag will completely dominate a small movement in a small Asian country. Note that this takes away from OG's impact because now the West can't even hear you, or if they do, they misidentify you with their own movement without actually understanding it. Great, the woke white liberal on the west coast of California understands you, but do they really understand the day-to-day struggle, and what is their impact to the average person who is fighting in this movement? That has never been elucidated to you by the entire Gov bench. Again, see that if we alienate the people next door for the expense of the people across the world, well, yes, we eventually need international support. If you lose it right at the beginning, you're basically screwed, okay? This is where our characterization of Western instability comes into play, right? You're breaking down the fundamental building blocks of Asian collectivism and the emphasis on stability, right? Specifically, you introduce foreign Western concepts from Western countries. And we separate from OO, who talks about the mind of the individual, because we're actually we're looking at how this challenges the actual nationalistic fabrics of these countries, which are actually formerly colonized nations. This does nothing to bring the masses to your side. If this is seen as an assault on the nation state, you lose any patriots or any more conservative culture that aligns themselves with this state, right? These national identities are clearly important for countries such as China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. All these other countries in East Asia identify seriously with the nation state. Now, introduction of foreign concepts introduced social instability to a government already wary of foreign Western influence, especially post-colonial nations. Any government would immediately recognize these movements and engender a clampdown much faster. The Me Too movement, again, was almost immediately banned. They can't claim that impact. Once this clampdown happens, it doesn't really matter how big of a flag you have to rally around. Compare this specifically to the grassroots movements that are not linked to well-known Western movements that creep up on the government in the local populace before they're undeniable. Again, note our Chinese feminist example. Panel, very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for that speech. We'd like to call upon the government to end the case beside government. Here.
Hi, just give me 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Right. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 3, 2, 1. Opening government asserted to you why these movements are so fractured. We tell you what the actual status of these groups is in status quo and why those local words and why those local rehashed concepts are unlikely to work. We properly prove to you why minorities get the kind of snowball effect to get the kind of change that opening government wanted. And we give them an accessible way to feel proud of their identity and disassociate from the humiliation of the words that the oppressors have forced onto them. OG's benefits only come when you buy our analysis of why these movements and why these local words don't work. I'm first going to respond to closing opposition and tell you why our extension beats them. And second, I'm going to tell you why opening opposition doesn't actually get any other change they want to. So first, what did we hear from closing opposition in the debate? I think the greatest issue is that in lieu of analysis for why movements are likely to work on their side, they just give one example without any mechanization for why this is likely to happen. So what specifically did they say, right? The only thing that they tell us is that protesting in China is really bad, where they're instantly just trying to cherry pick one single example and notice that there is a lot more nuance to this debate that they just never engaged with, right? Because we are specifically talking about the kind kind of concepts and words that people are likely to use, and how people go ahead and associate with those words and with those concepts, and how they therefore start viewing their identities. And that is what closing government exclusively brought to you within this debate, right? We don't think they can get away with saying an obvious thing that like protesting in China is bad, ignoring the nuance that exists like across all of Asia. But that isn't something that's really important within this debate. But more importantly, we think what we heard from them is that that what is really important is that getting that the backing matters from your own neighbors and from your not from like the international community. I think the first and biggest problem here is that it's just a ridiculous strawman for them to claim that international support means that we end up ditching local support entirely, and this is entirely asserted in the previous speech, right? There is absolutely no reason to believe why you cannot simultaneously use #MeToo on Twitter and like publish pamphlets like locally and like have your own Facebook pages and your own Facebook posts to go ahead and send to the kind of people you want to care about. Notice crucially that the reason why these can exist simultaneously is simply because of the way these social movements spread and the way these social movements work, right? That is, say, if you are a member of the minority community, you will be sharing these posts to the kind of people you think you need to be talking to the most. You will be sharing the kind of details and the kind of information to the people who are closest to you, who you think you are likely and who you are able to change. It is absolutely untrue for them to claim that like just like using these international words and these international Western tags means that we end up ditching local support entirely. But crucially, we're obviously trying to convince minorities themselves and teaching people with conservative ideas on how to address these minorities. And notice that over here, again, closing government's extension becomes incredibly important because we actually tell you the kind of pre-existing biases people have against local words and the fact that the kind of words these people are forced to use to represent themselves within a lot of these Asian countries are often slurs in these regions, such as the H word to describe like transgender people, for example, and this already has a really negative connotation within those communities. The fact that you are able to like reset the way people think about this and use neutral words that are more likely to be neutral in people's minds that are away from these like hacked old conservative concepts is precisely where we think we are more likely to get this kind of backing from your neighbors. Because again, notice that the only example that closing opposition wanted to talk about is that protesting is bad, and there was a lot more nuance that closing government gave to you this debate. But most importantly, we think the greatest issue when we are talking about these movements here is how we make these movements themselves stick. That is to say, how do you prevent the kind of burnout that minorities are likely to feel because of the kind of humiliation that comes with having to represent yourself using words that are like humiliating and are like slurs that are used by the majority to describe you, right? We think that when you find alternate avenues through these like Western concepts to redefine your identity and to redefine yourselves in ways you are likely to feel proud about, away from the kind of like humiliation the kind of bullying that you faced throughout your childhood, is precisely where we think a lot more of these minorities are likely to buy into the movement and are a lot more likely to just like participate in the movement a lot more. That's why you're more likely to go ahead and like petition for the kind of change that we think is really crucial. And that is where the snowball effect that OG wanted to claim really happens in closing government's paradigm. And finally, the just jealous is that like in China, like the state-run media is what was actually effective. And again, notice that that can still be used on our paradigm, right? We obviously don't use BBC to like reach villages in India. And the greatest problem with closing opposition and this bench is that you need to do a unique mechanism on your side to convince these same conservatives as to how they are going to change their mindset and how they are going to change their viewpoint. And they never give you an opposition bench what this mechanism of change is, apart from like one example without any structural analysis, right? We tell you why these words and why these methods don't work, such as things like the negative insulting and the fact that people are normalized to the kind of protest methods that exist within those countries and that they end up losing that shock value, which we think, for example, that taking down statues in India is likely to bring in. It is that we think really leads to the kind of chill that we are looking for, right? And that's probably why we think that CO doesn't like have enough of a positive case to win over us in this debate. What then did we hear from opening opposition? I think the first thing to deal with quickly is the assertion that came from leader of opposition that they will end up inventing new words or concepts that they can use to like describe these movements. Because notice first that they never prove why these are likely to be successful, and they never prove why these are likely to stick within the people who need them the most, right? The issue is that words these words have meaning, and getting these words to stick is quite hard, especially because it's likely to be seen as a derivative of that language, of that culture. What happens in CG's paradigm is that you end up getting a reference point as to how you ought to describe yourself. You get a reference point as to how you can like define what the goals of the movements are, and crucially, you get a reference point on how these movements are seen to work, because these movements are pre-established and relatively successful within these Western cultures, right? This is completely different and far more easier than inventing entirely new words or concepts and then trying to like make them stick in places where people still probably don't care that much about you. But the next thing that we hear from opening opposition is that they're trying to like get people to like that they want to represent people in the most faithful and most accurate way possible. The issue is that with all of the analysis, it does that those words and feelings that they want to represent aren't things that people self-identify into. They're often boxes and stereotypes that they've been forced into, as is the case with like transgender people within India, because I don't think that most like transgender people want to feel like divine or otherized in the way like opening opposition seems to think is incredibly important. The issue is that the goal of this movement isn't making a utopia where these people are perfectly represented. It's about where they are more successful at getting marginal changes about like serious problems such as like legal issues within the country. And that is again where closing government tells you that the fact that minority movements are far more likely to be cohesive because you give them an alternative way to get out of those words is precisely where we're far more likely to be successful and far more representative at getting really, really important change. I am incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that speech. We'd like to call upon the last speaker of the debate, here.
I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm going to start my speech with asking 2 clarifying questions. One, the first clarifying question is, in this debate, which masses matter when we talk about commanding attention for social movements? And the second clarifying question is, which side do command the attention of the masses the most and can cause the social movement into long-term success? So let's deal with OG's case first with the first clarifying question, which masses matter. First, in their case, they bring up the diversity of issues. It is ironic that OG recognizes that there are a diversity of issues in the biggest continent in the world, but does not understand why using an umbrella term from the West is uniquely harmful. Firstly, CO's point deals with OG and how movements in different countries, especially those of smaller countries in Asia, will be drowned out by every other countries who are using the hashtag on the same platform. They cannot claim the impact of international support when internationally people will be distracted by the mass influx of different issues under the same tag and will most likely choose to focus on the original Western movement that coined the term. For example, if we use BLM, people in the West, in the international community, will be more likely to look towards BLM movement in the US, Me Too movement in the US, rather than the hundreds of different countries' issues being fluxed under the same tag on Instagram or Twitter. Secondly, CO uses China to illustrate to the panel that not every Asian countries choose to use Western media tool. And the only answer we get from the government side is, quote, Asia is not China. Sure, we understand that, but China is representative of an entire homogenous culture that refuses to use Western media. Thus, their point also fails here. And if they do not buy our China example, you can also look at Japan and Korea that uses other types of social media way more than they do Instagram or Twitter. And then to answer the clarifying question, OG talk about the existing support that is possible in the international community. But CO gives you the characteristics of the people who are in social movement. The point is to rally local support and cause changes within their own country. Sure, it'd probably be cool if a blogger on the West Coast of California says, hey, I support a movement in Japan or I support a movement in India, but they do not directly cause local changes within those countries. We tell you you that the existing sympathy given by Western audience does not matter as much if the fact that they're using foreign concepts to challenge the fundamental social fabric of a society wary of instability in those local countries. If you can't cause local changes within your nation state, social movement at the local level fails, and that is also a fundamental problem in CG's case, where they spend a lot of time talking about how to confront quote-unquote oppressors from the West, when the problem of these social movements that are not gaining momentum is because they cannot cause local changes. CG dealing with their case, CG focuses a lot on what I said about confronting the oppressor of the West, but they do not answer the question about local level of change. We fail to see why the language point matters. Do the social movements in a country, say India, the point is to convince Indians or white Americans? The pre-existing biases against local words by the international audience matter much less compared to what CO tells you, which is that Western foreign concepts that signal instability / colonial past threaten the local population and possibly governmental agency, and thus killing the social movements in its crib, which is dangerous for these marginalized groups. Before that, I'll take OG.
Okay, so let's assume it will be drowned out, meaning that under our side, the best case that the support is slow. Why is your comparative better given only one subsect of that community that you're fighting for in Asia will rise up over the other? Please engage, or just unengage by opening up and also your member.
Okay, I'm gonna go into that and give you a comparative at the end of my speech, but the quick answer to that is we think using local platform, local words, and grassroots movement in these countries will rally necessary support from the population, because first, it's not a foreign concept that signal instability, and second, it is much more receptible to conservative and local members of that population. And also, actually, to give credit to our front half, they do deal with that point when they say people are more receptive to their own cultural terms. But moving on to the second clarifying question, can you command the attention of the masses? And on which side do we do this better, right? This is where CO takes the debate. OO tells you that local words are more suitable and representative, and that Western term can be colonization of the mind, which we agree with those points. However, CO's point are broader in its breadth and deeper in its breadth when we deal with the fundamental social fabric of Asian countries being different from Western nations. You break down the building blocks of a more collectivist society, making it hard to gain acceptance, right? In the West, people highlight ethnic identity or gender identities and cause political instability as a tool to achieve cause, because it is a more individualistic view onto society. This is praised because a more individualist culture where putting the need of the individual groups always above base social paradigms are accepted and celebrated, like my partner's speech about how BLM movement in the COVID time is accepted and celebrated, even though that could not possibly be something that happens in majority of Asian nations. However, in Asia, this will not work because the larger collectivist culture pushes back onto instability. Any groups being identified as the cost of instability will be condemned and not listened to. Since those who need social movements are already marginalized group, they don't have that much social backing already. They are vulnerable to be identified as the cost of instability to begin with, and thus being used as a scapegoat. Feminist movement in China, for example, when protests started on the streets, nobody cared about them because they were quote unquote troublemakers, and that government arresting them did not cause a social upheaval. But the comparative, when the feminist movement took a different turn and used a more culturally acceptable strategies and terms, people started paying attention. And then we answer to you why Western strategy and terminology are bad in and of itself. First of all, it challenges national identity and signal troubles to those more conservative members of society. The nationalistic fabric of society is challenged since social movement necessarily already introduces instability within the country. The tag of a foreign concept becomes an added harm to the instability the movement already brings, because it signals the colonial past and the instability of foreign concept, what have you. Introduction, and this is where we give you a comparative and to answer OG's POI. Grassroots movement are much more effective because government will not be signaled. For example, if a movement is already famous in another country, it signals instability to government, and government can clamp down onto that movement as fast as they can, whereas grassroots movement that appeals to the population and government will be more helpful, therefore proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for that speech. With that, we come to the end of the debate. Speakers requested to perhaps leave the room. we will be deliberating. You
One
get
sec,
your...
guys. One sec.
Okay, go on.
Just one sec.
Go on. Yeah, yeah.
Really sorry. Really sorry. Guys, could you please return to the main Zoom call, because the moment the ballots are in, we're going to release the draws for the results and the draws for the semifinals. Thank you so much. Apartim.
Thanks for the debate.
Thanks for the
Yeah,
round,
perfect. So guys,
everyone.
yeah, we'll deliberate now.
Per round.
Bye. Thank you so
Debate.
much. Hi guys. So do we want to take a few minutes?
Sure, maybe a minute.
Okay. Mozaien?
Yeah, I think I'm fairly ready with an initial verdict, but a minute sounds
Yeah, let's just take a minute then, and then we'll probably go on.
Apartim, could you give me host permission so I could stop the stream?
Oh, I have no idea how to do that. Wait,
Just,
make host.
click on yes.
Yes.
Yes, thank you so
Did it
much.
work?